So today I am again on Therapy and Theology with two very brilliant men. Thank you guys so much. Dr. Joel Muddamalle and Jim Kress, licensed professional counselor. I want to talk about a topic that is complicated and yet is affecting women a lot. And it doesn't just affect women. Obviously, I want to say it affects young people that are not grown up. It affects men. But for the purpose of our conversation tucked within this series, specifically focusing on women, I want to talk about emotional abuse. And the reason that this is so complicated is, and I'm sure there are lots of reasons it's so complicated, but when I hear women talking about emotional abuse, I either hear it one extreme that they call almost everything emotional abuse, anything hard, challenging, difficult, even like a corrective criticism or whatever. It's swung so far over that they're calling everything emotional abuse. Or more commonly, what I'm hearing is they call very little emotional abuse because they're nervous to even use that word abuse. It sounds so big and so definitive.
Makes it real too in their mind. If I say that, oh my word.
And yet it's affecting a lot of people. So instead of trying to break apart, is this emotional abuse? Is this not emotional abuse? I want to just talk about today a spectrum from a difficult relationship all the way to a destructive relationship. I want to recognize where a difficult relationship turns into a destructive relationship. That has so many nuances, we can't possibly pinpoint it. And yet we can identify that there sometimes is a place where a difficult relationship slips into a destructive relationship, and we can't name that place. Just like we said on our pornography episode that we did, that we are going to be descriptive today, not prescriptive. In other words, we're going to talk about this issue, but we're not trying to prescribe that you or someone you love has this issue. So another spectrum that I want us to think about is not just difficult to destructive in the context of emotional abuse. Where does it slip from being just a hard conversation that you have over to emotional abuse? Another spectrum I want to talk about is the spectrum of severity. How severe is this? You know, you've got a criticism maybe on this end or something that just hurts your feelings on this end, all the way to verbal abuse on this end. And so there's a spectrum of severity. There's also a spectrum of occurrence. Did it happen once, or is it a pattern of behavior that happens all the time? So we've got three different spectrums, if you will, that I want us to kind of keep in the back of our mind as we're having this conversation. But here's where I want us to start. I'm going to read a list of some red flags. And again, this is descriptive, not prescriptive. But I just want to see, as I read this list, if you would consider this list and see if there's some red flags that exist in some of the relationships that you have that are difficult, possibly even destructive. And I want to start the list by saying, if you feel that you have to trade the best of who you are to protect the worst of who someone else is, that's not just a red flag. That's evidence of possibly a full fire. So let me read this list of red flags. They resist needed conversations or turn them against you. For example, when you bring up a topic that needs to be addressed, their denial of the issues at hand and surrounding facts leave you feeling like the crazy one. And if you are left feeling like the crazy one after a conversation, a needed conversation, then pay attention to that. Definite red flag. Another one that I want you to consider. They go back to unhealthy coping mechanisms when they have a bad day or a hard conversation. They lack self-awareness or are emotionally tone deaf. They are unable to understand how people perceive them. They have an out of proportion reaction to a conversation or a situation at hand that you want to address or that happens. They don't recognize the inappropriateness of their facial expressions, tone of voice, or timing in bringing up certain things. They tend not to own any of their parts of a conflict, always saying, but you, in response. And they're pinning it back on you as if you're the real source of the issues that they are displaying. More times than not, you can ask yourself, does this person lack empathy in situations, and do they refuse to consider how their choices will affect the other person? They are unwilling to honor or respect any communicated boundaries. They do not take responsibility for themselves or their actions and expect you to pick up the pieces. They refuse to acknowledge how unhealed trauma from their past, possibly even their childhood, needs to be worked out so it's not acted out. They rewrite history to prove a point that serves only them or their version of the truth. And I want you to pay attention to their version of the truth.
Yeah.
Because we have to remember sometimes opinions do not equal facts. So their version of the truth may not exactly line up with the absolute truth. Their version of reality is not consistent with the facts. Their version of the truth is what protects them, and they really can't discern what is and is not deception. They let their emotions get the best of them and sabotage what would otherwise have been a beautiful moment. Instead of acknowledging or confessing wrongdoing, they sweep it under the rug and hope they're not caught. Now, I want to acknowledge, as I read that list, you may be thinking, oh no, some of those describe me. Like I'm doing some of those things. And of course, you're going to find yourself in this if you're a self-aware person, because none of us is perfect. But again, I want you to remember those spectrums that we talk about. You know, what's the spectrum of occurrence? How often is it happening? And what's the spectrum of severity? And I want to say I understand, you know, so I can find myself in some of these things. But at least we're self-aware enough to know, hey, that's a call to action. I need to work on that. So if we're progressing toward working on the issues that we recognize, then that's a sign of health and that's a sign of progress. But what if you are listening to this list and you're recognizing a lot of those are present in a relationship that I have? That's where I want to consider, are you in a difficult relationship or are you in a destructive relationship? So, Jim, and certainly this is not an exhaustive list.
Right.
There's many other descriptions that we could, but I just wanted to get us thinking in the right direction. I know we can't pinpoint the place where we shift from a difficult relationship, like normal difficulties in a relationship, to the place where a destructive relationship is happening, or that a difficult relationship crosses over into a destructive relationship. But can you help us discern what are some of those evidences that we are in a possibly destructive relationship?
Well, thank you. Yes, let's take those items that Lisa has just mentioned, which will also be contained and found in Good Boundaries and Goodbye.
That's right.
And so you can literally see that in print. And I would put a Likert scale on that of 1 to 5. And that is looking at the progression on each one of those statements. That's a 1, that's a 2, man, that's a 5, 5, 4, whatever else, and tally those up in the end. And I'd look, in the word I'm using here is just progression. Does there seem to be a progression? Look at frequency of occurrence again. How often does that happen? If you want to say, well, I do some of that too, that's honest. But to look in there and say, it feels like it's progressed. I always look at, well, has it progressed in the last 2 years? Are the kids out of the nest? And once the empty nest, did it really progressed? Whatever. And just take note with a holy contemplation of, yeah, it's probably this number on all of those. Again, you know me, I'm going to say, how about that list? Don't weaponize it, but you take it in by yourself, not to your spouse, whoever, with a counselor, and say, I've noticed this, and I'd really like to sit down and talk about it. By the way, they want to find a counselor like our dear mutual friend, Leslie Vernick, who I have spent so much time with. Because Leslie just doesn't freak out. She doesn't jump on and bash men. And a grounded therapist, because sometimes they're not. Therapists can be triggered into their own stuff. And someone says, okay, let's contemplate. Let's take a look at this and have someone. And then once you get the data out, facing the reality, what do you want to do with it? It's a whole nother story. That's where that invitation could be. I've done a lot of this, quite frankly, with couples. Can they both come in? Sometimes the woman would meet criteria for verbal and emotional abuse herself of the husband and say, hey, let's talk about this. Hurt people hurt people. They're not just necessarily trying to be mean, but some outside help to get some kind of confirmation. Yeah, this is what's going on.
And I love that you mentioned Leslie Vernick. She's a friend of both of ours. And she has some amazing books around this topic. And she really tackles the emotionally destructive relationships. So you can get so much more information from her. And she has support groups. I know she has a Conquer group. I'm speaking at it at one of her meetings or conferences that she has. So I definitely encourage that. And then you mentioned my book, Good Boundaries and Goodbyes, which really does help give ideas of how to draw healthy boundaries, which is often what you're going to need as you get the awareness that maybe it's not even emotionally abusive, but maybe this is dysfunctional, or all the way to it is emotionally abusive. So how do we draw boundaries that keep us safe? In my book, Good Boundaries and Goodbyes, I'm very clear. We don't put boundaries on another person to try to control them, to try to make them stop, to try to manipulate them into new patterns of behavior, or even beg them into better actions or better words that they use. But instead, we put a boundary on ourselves, and we say, it's my responsibility to keep myself safe. And so if I recognize this is becoming more than just difficult, this is becoming something that is leading me to the place where I say, I can't take this anymore. Or this is ridiculous. This should not be happening in this relationship. Instead of feeling paralyzed and swirling in those statements, boundaries give you some logical, practical actions to take that will help you determine that you deserve to be kept safe, and here's what I'm going to do about it, so that you're not left feeling powerless in a difficult situation.
Yeah, and let me just go to the title. Okay, I want to be vulnerable. You know how we do that sometimes, Joel, here off camera, sometimes on camera. I've never asked you this, and if I did, I forget. The steps, logical, practical. Notice the very title of the book. People go too quickly, which I get. They hit the gas. Well, do I need a divorce? And what do I do? And I need to say goodbye. No. Notice the title. So I've never asked you. I'm assuming it was planned that way, that we start with the steps of progression of good boundaries first. Don't even worry about the goodbye. Good boundaries, then it flows in. If the boundaries are being violated time and time again, you're clear. Remember, a boundary without a consequence is a mere suggestion. You do that, and then says this person just, no matter why, I call it Tai Chi, just they move their hands away, and every boundary they're just violating. Then I can be on the cusp of the next part of the book is, what about a goodbye? I mean, did you plan it that way in the title? I don't think I ever asked you that.
Yeah, the subtitle is really important of my book, and it is Loving Others Well Without Losing the Best of Who You Are. So this isn't about pushing others away.
Right.
This is about learning to love others well without making yourself so depleted and so just beaten down by the circumstances that the worst version of you is front and center, either because you're being defensive to protect yourself, or you're trying to control to make things better, or whatever. So there's definitely a progression. I want us to fight for love, because love is the cornerstone of who God is, and who God calls us to be. And we have to recognize we also live in a sinful world where love has been distorted. Relationships have become more complicated. But where there is a presence of chaos in a relationship, there is a need for a boundary. And then where boundaries are repeatedly violated over and over, then you have to pay attention to asking yourself the question, is this relationship safe? And is this relationship sustainable? And if not, then that's where you have to get educated about a goodbye. But it was important to me to go straight to Scripture.
Love that.
And ask ourselves some questions. Like, Is it biblical to draw boundaries? And what I discovered is it absolutely is biblical. And not only is it biblical, but boundaries are not just a good idea, they're God's idea.
Yeah, isn't that great?
And right from the very beginning, God establishes boundaries even in creation. God established a boundary in the first recorded conversation with man when he talked with Adam in the garden about you can eat from all of these trees in the garden, but just not this tree. That was a boundary.
Wait, I thought boundaries was a modern idea. The books that are written that John Townsend, Henry Cloud, and others wrote, and it's like, I know you've said this many times, like, it just tickles me. It's like, this is as far back as we can go. God's is a boundaried God. This is not a new modern idea in pop psychology, is it? Yeah.
And God didn't do it to, overly control the human. There was freedom there. You remember when he says to Adam, you are free. So it's in the context of freedom. But true freedom can never happen if we don't know where the boundary lines are. If we know where the boundary lines are, then we run free within the safety of those boundary lines. And God didn't do it to restrict the man and just for a killjoy act of God, He did it to protect the man. And the reason God said, do not eat from this tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because God wanted to protect humans from carrying the weight that the human heart was never supposed to carry, and that is the devastating weight of the knowledge of evil. So, Joel, what do you have to say in all of this from a theological standpoint about difficult relationships, destructive relationships, and just all that we're talking about today, and even emotional abuse? I would just love your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just taking a lot of this in, listening. I've been taking some notes, and I think one of the interesting things is that as we talk about dysfunctional relationships are evidence of disorder in the relationship. And when we think about disorder, I think the list that you gave us, Lisa, was so helpful, but I started to list down some categories. And so if you're in this situation, you're trying to categorize, how is this all working out? The categories are power. Is there a pursuit of power? Is there an influence of authority? Is there the presence of addiction? Is there disordered affection? Is there self-obsession? Are those the fuels that are underneath the individual that's trying to actually control you, that's actually trying to step in? And the interesting thing is theologically, there's this idea of God's sovereignty. And God's sovereignty, my old professor, Dr. John Frame, he talks about sovereignty in these three ways: that God's power, God's authority, and God's control. And so the presence of emotional abuse, I would even say spiritual abuse, it's actually a hijacking of what is rightfully held in the hands of God, which is safe and secure and can be handed out with justice and mercy and compassion. It's taking that out of God's hands and putting it into our own hands and trying to exercise our own power, our own authority, our own control, because we become self-absorbed in the process. And so if you're listening and you're experiencing this and you're wondering, like, gosh, like, is this just dysfunctional? Is this, start to look for those patterns, not just in that one area, but then say, okay, is the presence of this also in other areas? In finances? Is it present in relationships, in our circle of friends? Is there this self-serving, like, I talked about this the other day with a friend. If the theme in our minds is what's in it for me, that's a problem. Because that what's in it for me plays out in our marriages, in our relationships, in our vocations, in all of these different areas. And if that's the leading impulse of the human heart, what's in it for me, it's going to result in dysfunction and patterns of relationship that are unsustainable.
That's so good. So, Jim, is there a way for us to define emotional abuse? Like, are there any markers of it or some kind of definition where we can make sure we're all on the same page of what is this?
Yeah, thank you. I would pay attention to go to oneself, anyone watching or listening to this podcast right now. When someone simply does or says something, this will be a little tricky here, but doesn't do something, meaning there's something they should do or they've committed to do and they don't follow through. They're not keeping their word. Pay attention literally in what know you not that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, your body. And you feel, yeah, this doesn't feel right, or I don't like this. I feel kind of some anxiety. Always pay attention, to your body and say, something doesn't feel right. Watch. You've said it many times, including today again. I don't feel safe, or something feels distorted. Like I feel kind of messed with right now. I mean, what's really going on here? That's a sign, like a check engine light on the dashboard of your life. And then again, I'm just real big on having a safe friend, not an unsafe friend, or a therapist, pastor, whoever, to go and say, this has been going on to me. My spouse is doing this or not doing that, saying this or not saying that, and I have a check in my spirit. I wonder about this, and I'm coming in curious, not furious, and say, wonder what's going on for me. And what we want there is someone, good therapists do it, is they mirror back. Whoa, what I'm hearing you say is, my little hub I do, H, I hear you, U, I understand you, and B, I believe you. So they mirror back and say, here's what I'm hearing, and we continue to have dialogue around that. I want to get those stories out of my head. I don't want to be in judgment like that. Get them out of my head and put them on the right board of somebody else sitting across from me over a cup of coffee and say, what do you hear me saying or struggling with? It doesn't mean the other person's right, but I want to get it external versus all these internal conversations.
And if going to a therapist feels a little bit like, oh no, am I tattletelling on this other person? Like, I don't want to betray my mom, but I've got some issues with my mom that I need to check out with a therapist, or I don't want to betray my husband by going to a therapist, because that almost feels like I'm going to go and tell things about him that he wouldn't want me to tell. If there's any of that. You
notice how right there the person's trapped? We're all talking about emotionally abusive or destructive or difficult. Watching the Likert scale I said earlier, from 1 to 5, rank these things that Lisa has in her book and she's talked about. And so inside, you just said it. I wonder what he will think. And all I'm going to do is biblically let someone bear my burdens, share this and say, what do you think? In the multitude of counselors, it doesn't have to be a professional. In the multitude of counselors, there's wisdom and safety. I'm saying, hey, I want to check this out about me, keeping me safe, not about him. An emotionally destructive or abusive person is not spouse in some cases, doesn't want you. It's like a cult. Keep it inside the city. I mean, don't go tell. So that piece I'm already
and that in and of
worried.
Itself is a red flag.
It's a red flag. So what would he think? It's like, but I'm not going to tell. My goal is to express and discern in wisdom, not to go and betray him. And most women I've worked with, they say, I'll say, come on, what's your thought or your goal? Is it to betray him? Well, no, not at all. I want to process me. There's your answer.
And to get educated.
Well, of course.
It's no secret, Jim, you are my counselor, and you've done such a fabulous job of
thank you.
Absolutely doing exactly what you said, helping me feel. Feel understood, helping me feel seen, giving me a place to process. process my questions and what is this? And one of the things that's been so helpful is the education you've given me so that I can, instead of things kind of floating around like